17 years ago, on my 15th birthday, my father threw an empty suitcase at my face during a Chicago blizzard and told me to die. He was right about one thing. That weak girl is gone. Today, my parents stand shivering at the gates of my 10-acre estate, clutching a crumpled DNA test. They have no idea that the discarded daughter they are here to beg from is now the sole heir to a $4 billion empire. My name is Aurora Waverly. Before I was a headline, before I was a billionaire, and before I was the woman who could crush a competitor with a single line of code, I was a ghost haunting the hallways of a Georgian mansion in the suburbs of Chicago, in the Waverly household. Perfection was not an aspiration. It was the oxygen we breathed. And silence was the currency we used to pay for our comfort. My father, the Honorable Judge Jonathan Waverly, did not have a family. He had a portfolio of assets. My mother, Catherine, was the curator of this museum of misery, dusting the frames of our family portraits while ignoring the rot eating away at the canvas behind them. I grew up understanding that love was conditional. It was a transaction. If I received an A+, I earned a nod. If I played the piano concerto without missing a note, I earned the right to eat dinner without a lecture on mediocrity. But transactions can be voided. Contracts can be terminated. I just never realized how quickly the termination clause could be invoked until the winter of my 15th year. It was mid-January, and Chicago was in the grip of a polar vortex that turned Lake Michigan into a jagged sheet of gray ice. The cold outside was brutal, but it was nothing compared to the temperature inside the library of St. Jude's Academy. I sat in a leather chair that was too big for me, my hands folded in my lap to stop them from shaking. Across the desk sat Headmaster Collins and my father. The accusation was severe. The school server had been breached. Grades had been altered. Final exam questions for the upcoming semester had been sold to the highest bidders. The digital trail, clumsy and obvious, led straight to my laptop. I had not done it. I knew exactly who had done it. It was Preston Street. James and his circle of untouchables. The sons of senators and oil tycoons who smoked behind the gymnasium and treated the faculty like hired help. They had needed a scapegoat, and who better than Aurora Waverly, the quiet girl, the one who spent her lunch breaks in the computer lab, the one who actually knew how to code. Unlike the spoiled brats who could barely operate a search engine, I had tried to explain this. I had tried to point out the discrepancies in the timestamps, the fact that the IP address had been spoofed, but nobody was listening. Headmaster Collins looked at my father with a mixture of apology and expectation. He was waiting for the judge to advocate for his daughter. He was waiting for Jonathan Waverly to demand a thorough investigation, to threaten a lawsuit, to protect his own blood. Instead, my father stood up. He smoothed the front of his bespoke suit jacket. He did not look at me. He looked at the window, staring at the snow beginning to fall. "I accept the expulsion," my father said. His voice was even, devoid of any tremor. It was the voice he used when sentencing a petty thief to 5 years in state prison. "We will remove her from the premises immediately." My breath hitched in my throat. I tried to speak, to say, "Daddy, please, I didn't do it." But the look he finally cast in my direction silenced me. It was not anger. Anger implies passion. Anger implies that he cared enough to be upset. This was revulsion. It was the look one gives to a garment that has been stained by red wine, a sudden realization that the object is ruined and must be discarded. The drive home was silent. The silence was heavy, suffocating, filling the interior of the luxury sedan like concrete. I watched the wipers slash back and forth against the snow. Counting the rhythm, 1, 2, 1, 2, I was 15 years old. I was innocent, and I knew, with a terrifying clarity, that my life was over. We arrived at the estate just as the storm began to intensify. The sky was a bruised purple, the wind howling through the skeletal oak trees lining the driveway. Inside, the house was warm, smelling of lemon polish and potpourri. My mother was in the dining room, arranging white lilies in a crystal vase. She looked up as we entered, her smile faltering when she saw my father's face. "Is it done?" she asked. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not ask if the accusations were true. She asked if the problem had been managed. "She is expelled," Jonathan said, walking past her to the liquor cabinet. He poured himself a scotch. "Neat. The dean has agreed to keep the specific details quiet if we withdraw her immediately. He calls it a behavioral issue, but the rumors will start. My confirmation hearing for the appellate court is in 3 months. Catherine, 3 months." He turned to face me then. I was standing in the foyer, still wearing my school uniform, my backpack heavy on my shoulders. I felt small. I felt like an intruder in my own home. "You are a cancer," he said. The words were soft, which made them worse. A loud voice can be ignored. A whisper sinks into your bones. I have spent 15 years building a reputation. I have spent a lifetime constructing a legacy of integrity and law. And you, with your petty, criminal mind, have jeopardized everything. "I didn't do it," I whispered. My voice cracked. "It was Preston. They hacked my—" "Enough!" The shout cracked through the room like a whip. My mother flinched, her hand knocking against a lily, sending a shower of pollen onto the mahogany table. "I do not care about the details," Jonathan hissed. Stepping closer to me, I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "I care about the result. You are a liability. You are a stain, and I will not have a stain on this family." He pointed to the door. "Get out." I blinked, confused. I thought he meant get out of the room, go to my bedroom, be grounded for a year. That was the standard punishment. I stood there, frozen. "You are deaf as well as criminal?" he asked. I said, "Get out of this house. You are no longer welcome here. You are not my daughter. My daughter would not bring shame to this name. My daughter is dead to me." He walked to the front closet and pulled out a suitcase. It was an old one, dusty, one we never used. He didn't unzip it. He didn't ask me to pack. He simply threw the empty suitcase at me. It hit my shin with a dull thud, sliding across the marble floor. "Fill it with your shame and leave," he said. "Do not come back until you have scrubbed the poverty off your soul. Do not come back until you are worthy of the name you have dragged through the mud." I looked at my mother. "Please, Mom." Catherine Waverly looked at me. For a second, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Pain. Maybe? Maternal instinct? But then she looked at her husband, the powerful judge, the man who controlled the bank accounts and the social calendar. She looked at the life she had built, and she made her choice. She turned her back to me. She reached out and adjusted the stem of a lily that was slightly askew. "Your father is right, Aurora," she said to the flowers. "We cannot have this chaos. It is bad for his blood pressure." That was the moment it broke, that invisible tether that connects a child to their parents, the biological imperative that says these people are your protectors. It snapped. It didn't sound like a gunshot. It sounded like the soft rustle of a silk blouse as a mother turned away. I did not scream. I did not beg. A strange, cold calm washed over me, matching the temperature of the storm outside. I picked up the empty suitcase. I didn't go upstairs to pack clothes. I didn't want anything they had bought me. I had my backpack. I had the coat on my back. "Give me your phone," my father demanded, holding out his hand, "and your cards." I reached into my pocket and handed him the latest model smartphone, the platinum credit card attached to his account. He took them without touching my skin, as if I were contagious. "Now go," he said. I opened the heavy oak front door. The wind hit me instantly, a physical blow that nearly knocked me backward. Snow swirled into the foyer, melting on the pristine marble. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind me. The sound of the latch clicking into place was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a casket closing. I walked down the long, winding driveway. The snow was already ankle-deep and falling fast. I was wearing loafers, thin tights, and a wool school coat that was designed for fashion, not for a Chicago blizzard. Within 2 minutes, my feet were numb. Within 5, my face burned with the cold. I had no money. I had no phone. I had no destination. I walked toward the main road. The wind screamed in my ears, drowning out my thoughts. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Left, right, left, right. If I stopped, I would freeze. I made it to the bus shelter near the intersection of Highland and Main. It was a 3-sided glass box that offered minimal protection from the biting wind. I huddled in the corner, pulling my knees to my chest. Trying to preserve whatever body heat I had left, the street was deserted. Who would be out in this weather? Only the lost and the damned. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I was shaking so hard my teeth chattered, a rhythmic clicking sound inside my skull. A beat-up sedan slowed down as it passed the shelter. It stopped a few yards away. The window rolled down. A man leaned across the passenger seat. He had a thick face, pockmarked skin, and a smile that made my stomach turn over. "You look cold." "Sweetheart," he called out. "You need a ride?" Panic flared in my chest. Hot and sharp. I was a 15-year-old girl alone in a blizzard. I was prey. "No." I yelled over the wind. "My father is on his way. He is a police officer." It was the first lie of my new life. It came easily, instinctively. The man laughed. A wet, hacking sound. "I don't see no cop car." "Girlie, come on. I got a heater in here." He opened his door and started to step out. I stood up. I didn't cower. I didn't retreat. I channeled the only thing I had left, the cold arrogance of Jonathan Waverly. I imagined I was him, looking down at a criminal from the bench. I reached into my coat pocket and gripped a pen, holding it like a shiv. "Take one more step," I shouted, my voice cutting through the wind, "and I will scream so loud every dog in this neighborhood will wake up. And when the cops get here, I will tell them you tried to drag me into that car. You want a kidnapping charge on your record tonight?" He paused. He looked at my face. He didn't see a scared little girl. He saw something unhinged. He saw the fury of a creature that had just been kicked out of its den. He spat into the snow, slammed his door, and peeled away, his tires spinning on the ice before gripping the asphalt. I watched his taillights fade into the whiteout. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I slumped back onto the bench. I was alive. I was alone. But I was alive. I turned my head and looked back toward the hill where the Waverly estate sat. Through the swirling snow, I could see the golden glow of the windows. They were probably sitting down to dinner now. The roast beef would be medium rare. The wine would be a vintage Bordeaux. They would be talking about the election, about the weather, about anything except the daughter they had just sentenced to death by hypothermia. I did not cry. The tears would have frozen on my cheeks anyway. Instead, I felt a fire ignite deep in my gut. It was small, burning on the fuel of pure hatred. But it was hot enough to keep me warm. They wanted me to disappear. They wanted me to die so their reputation could live. I stood up and faced the empty road, waiting for a bus, a truck, anything that would take me away from this zip code. "You made a mistake, Jonathan," I whispered into the wind. "You didn't kill me. You just set me free. And one day, I am going to buy the very ground you stand on, and I will be the one to close the door." The headlights of a city bus cut through the dark. I stepped toward the curb, leaving the empty suitcase behind in the snow. I didn't need it. I didn't need their baggage. I was Aurora Waverly, and I had a life to build. 5 years is a long time when you are measuring it in shifts worked, plates scraped, and toilets scrubbed. If you had looked at me when I was 20 years old, you would not have recognized the girl who once wore cashmere sweaters and attended gala dinners. The Chicago wind had roughened my skin, and the relentless grind of survival had hardened my eyes. I was no longer Aurora Waverly, the heiress. I was just Aurora, the girl who worked the morning shift at a grease-stained diner called Sal's, the afternoon shift washing dishes at a Chinese takeout joint, and the night shift cleaning office floors in the business district. My hands were perpetually red and chapped from bleach and hot water. My back ached with a dull, constant throb that I had simply learned to ignore. I lived in a universe of gray exhaustion, where sleep was a luxury I could rarely afford. I had bounced between 3 different women's shelters before finally scraping together enough cash to rent a studio apartment in the crumbling underbelly of the city. It was a basement unit with peeling lead paint, a radiator that hissed but gave no heat, and a colony of cockroaches that scurried for cover every time I turned on the single flickering light bulb. But I was free. That was the mantra I repeated to myself when I was scraping gum off the underside of a table or unclogging a drain full of hair. I was free of Jonathan's judgment and Catherine's silence. However, I had a secret that kept the spark of my old self alive. Every night, or rather, early every morning between my cleaning shift and the diner opening, I went to the public library. It was the only place that was warm, quiet, and free. While other homeless youth slept in the corners, I sat at the bulky, outdated public terminals. I taught myself to code. I devoured books on C++, Python, and Java. I wasn't just reading them, I was memorizing them. I treated syntax like poetry. The logic of coding was a balm to my chaotic life. In the real world, bad things happen to good people for no reason. In the code, if there was an error, there was a reason, and it could be fixed. It was a world of pure control, and I was starving for control. It was during this period of exhaustion and hidden ambition that I met Bradley. He walked into Sal's diner on a rainy Tuesday, carrying a battered guitar case and wearing a leather jacket that had seen better days. He had messy brown hair, eyes the color of whiskey, and a smile that seemed to promise that he knew a secret joke about the universe. He sat in my section, ordered a black coffee, and spent 2 hours writing lyrics on napkins. When I brought him the check, he looked up at me and said that I had the saddest, most beautiful eyes he had ever seen. I was 20. I was lonely. I was desperate for someone to look at me and see a human being, not just a waitress or a maid. I fell for it. I fell for him with the velocity of a stone dropped down a well. Bradley was a musician. He told me he was on the verge of his big break. He told me he just needed time to focus on his art, that the world wasn't ready for his sound yet. But it would be soon. He painted a picture of a future where we would travel the world. Him playing sold-out shows and me by his side. His muse. He moved into my cockroach-infested basement 2 weeks later. For the first few months, I thought I was in heaven. The apartment was still cold. But now there was someone to hold me at night. He wrote songs about me. He called me his savior. He told me that my parents were fools for letting me go, and that he was the only one who truly understood the depth of my soul. I believed him. I wanted to believe him so badly that I ignored the math. The math was simple. I was working 3 jobs. Bradley was working 0. He said he couldn't work a regular job because it crushed his creative spirit. He said his hands were his livelihood, and he couldn't risk injuring them with manual labor. So, I took on extra shifts. I worked double shifts on Sundays. I started cleaning houses on my one morning off. I paid the rent. I bought the groceries. I paid for his cigarettes and the strings for his guitar. I convinced myself that this was an investment in our future. I was the supportive partner. I was proving that I could love unconditionally, unlike my parents. But love does not pay the electric bill. The cracks started to show a year into our relationship. Bradley was moody. If I didn't have enough money for the specific brand of whiskey he liked, he would sulk for days, plucking angry, discordant notes on his guitar. He stopped writing songs about me and started writing songs about being trapped, about being misunderstood. Then came the morning I woke up with a nausea so violent it sent me running to the stained sink in the corner of the room. I knew, even before I bought the cheap test from the pharmacy. I knew. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, staring at the 2 pink lines. My heart hammered against my ribs. Fear was the first emotion. How could I afford a baby? I could barely afford to feed Bradley. But then, a second wave hit me. A warmth, a connection, a family. This was my blood. This was a person who would belong to me, and whom I would never, ever turn away. I promised the tiny speck of life inside me right then and there that I would die before I let them feel unwanted. I waited for Bradley to come home from his open mic night. He stumbled in around 2 in the morning, smelling of stale beer and cheap perfume. "I have news," I said, sitting up on the mattress we had on the floor. He groaned, kicking off his boots. "Can it wait?" "Aurora?" The sound guy was a total jerk tonight. He cut my set short. "I'm pregnant," I said. The silence that followed was heavy. He stopped unbuttoning his shirt. He turned slowly to look at me. There was no joy in his eyes. There was no wonder. There was only a cold, calculating panic. "Pregnant?" he repeated, as if I had said I was infected with a plague. "Are you sure?" I nodded. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small room. 3 steps one way, 3 steps back. "We can't have a kid. Aurora, look at this place. Look at us. I'm just about to get my break. I can't have a crying baby keeping me up all night. I need my sleep. I need my focus. We can make it work," I said, my voice trembling. "I will work harder. I will pick up more shifts." "You already work all the time," he shouted. "You are never here as it is. Who is going to watch the kid?" "Me? You expect me to become a babysitter?" He looked at me with disgust. "You need to get rid of it." The words were a slap in the face. I instinctively wrapped my arms around my stomach. "No," I said firmly. "I am keeping this baby." Bradley scoffed and turned away, refusing to look at me for the rest of the night. The next few weeks were a nightmare. The tension in the apartment was suffocating. Bradley barely spoke to me. He came home later and later. I worked myself to the bone, hiding my pregnancy under baggy sweatshirts at the diner so my boss wouldn't fire me. I started saving every single penny I could find. I found an old coffee tin and hid it behind a loose brick in the wall behind the toilet. Every tip, every quarter I found on the sidewalk, every dollar I squeezed out of the grocery budget went into that tin. It was my escape fund. It was for the hospital bills. It was for the baby. I managed to save $600. It felt like a fortune. It was my lifeline. One evening, I came home early because the nausea had been so bad I almost fainted into a customer's soup. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. I saw Bradley's guitar case was gone. A cold dread pooled in my stomach. I ran to the bathroom. I pulled the loose brick out of the wall. The coffee tin was there. I shook it. Silence. I pried the lid off. Empty. My $600, my blood, sweat, and tears. The money for my baby's first breath. Gone. I ran out of the apartment. I knew where the music shop was. The one where he had been drooling over a vintage Fender Stratocaster for months. I found him 2 blocks away. But he wasn't at the music shop. He was walking out of a high-end bar, laughing. He had the new guitar slung over his shoulder, shining under the streetlights. But he wasn't alone. Hanging on his arm was a woman. She was older, maybe 45, wearing a fur coat and heavy makeup. She was looking at him with the same adoring gaze I used to have. "Bradley!" I screamed. He froze. The woman looked at me, then at my stained waitress uniform, and wrinkled her nose. "Who is this?" the woman asked. Bradley looked at me. For a moment, I saw shame, but then it hardened into something cruel. He needed to discard me to secure his new patron. "She is nobody," Bradley said. "Just a crazy ex-girlfriend." I walked up to him, shaking with rage. "You stole my money. You stole the money for our child." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Our child? Come on, Aurora. You really think you can raise a kid? You?" He stepped closer, leaning down so only I could hear him. "You are damaged goods. Aurora, your own parents threw you out like garbage. They knew there was something wrong with you. If the people who made you couldn't love you, what makes you think you know how to love a child? You are going to ruin that kid, just like you ruined your own life." He pulled away and turned to the woman in the fur coat. "Sorry about that. Babe, she is delusional. Let's go." I stood on the sidewalk and watched them get into a sleek black taxi. I watched the taillights disappear, just like I had watched the taillights of that creep in the blizzard 5 years ago. He had taken my money. He had taken my dignity. He had taken the last shred of my belief in love. But as I stood there, Hand on my stomach, I felt a flutter, a tiny butterfly movement deep inside me. He was wrong. He said I couldn't raise a child because I had been abandoned. He was wrong. I would raise this child perfectly precisely because I had been abandoned. I knew exactly what not to do. I walked back to the empty, cockroach-filled apartment. I had $0 to my name. I was pregnant. I was alone. But as I sat on the floor, I didn't cry. I pulled my old laptop out from under the mattress. I opened it and stared at the lines of code on the screen. Bradley was just another bug in the system, and I had just debugged my life. I typed a single command line and hit enter. It was time to stop surviving and start operating. I had a daughter to fight for now, and her name would be Stella, because she was going to be the only light I needed in this dark, dark world. Labor in a county hospital is not the cinematic event they show in movies. There is no soft lighting, no supportive partner holding your hand, and certainly no private suite. It is a chaotic, screaming industrial assembly line of pain. I gave birth to my daughter on a gurney in a hallway because the delivery rooms were full. When the nurse finally handed her to me, wrapped in a rough, institutional blanket, the noise of the ward seemed to fade away. She was tiny, red-faced, and screaming with a lung capacity that commanded attention. I looked out the window, but there was no view of the city, only a brick wall. Yet, in that dingy hallway, I looked down at her and saw the only brightness I had left in my universe. I named her Stella. It means star. She was the single point of light in a sky that had gone pitch black. The first few months of Stella's life were a blur of sleeplessness and a desperate hustle for survival. I could not afford daycare, I could not afford a babysitter, and I certainly could not afford to stop working. The math of poverty is brutal. If you stop moving, you starve. So, I became a master of invisibility. I secured a job with a night cleaning crew that serviced the high-rise tech hub in downtown Chicago. It was a contracting company that asked few questions and paid in cash. The supervisor was a man named Old Joe, who spent most of the shift sleeping in the supply closet. This was my salvation. It meant I could bring Stella. Every night at 9 o'clock, I would strap Stella to my chest in a fabric wrap I had sewn myself from old t-shirts. I would put on my oversized blue jumpsuit, which hid her small form against my body, and we would enter the gleaming glass tower of Pendham Tech. For 8 hours a night, I was a ghost. I waxed marble floors that cost more than my entire life's earnings. I emptied trash cans filled with half-eaten gourmet sandwiches and discarded prototype devices. Stella usually slept against my chest, lulled by the rhythmic swishing of the mop and the hum of the server rooms. When she cried, I would dash to the soundproof lactation rooms on the 7th floor. Ironic, since they were built for female executives who likely never used them, and nurse her until she fell back asleep. I was exhausted. My bones felt like they were made of lead, but my mind was still sharp, and it was starving. Pendham Tech was the kingdom of Arthur Pendham, a man the business magazines called a visionary and the tabloids called a recluse. He was a billionaire who had built his empire on cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. The top floor, the 45th floor, was his sanctuary. It was also my assigned zone. One Tuesday night in November, the building was emptier than usual. A flu bug had taken out half the cleaning crew, so I was alone on the executive level. I pushed my cart into the main conference room, a space surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the city lights. The room was a mess. It looked like a war zone of intellect. Takeout boxes were scattered everywhere, and the smell of stale coffee hung heavy in the air. But what caught my eye was the whiteboard. It covered the entire north wall. It was covered in red and black marker. A dense jungle of algorithms, flowcharts, and angry question marks. I stopped mopping. I walked closer. It was a compression algorithm. I recognized the structure immediately. It was elegant, ambitious, and completely broken. I could see where the logic failed. The engineers had been trying to force a linear solution onto a recursive problem. They had written "impossible" in big block letters in the corner, underlined 3 times. I looked down at Stella. She was fast asleep, her tiny fist clutching the fabric of my shirt. I looked back at the board. My fingers twitched. It had been 5 years since I had been allowed to touch a computer in a meaningful way. But the language of code does not leave you. It is like a mother tongue. I shouldn't touch it. I was the janitor. My job was to erase the board, not add to it. If I were caught, I would be fired. If I were fired, we would be on the street. But the error was screaming at me. It was like hearing a piece of music resolve on the wrong note. It was physically painful to look at. I checked the hallway. Empty. The security cameras were fixed on the elevators, not the conference room interior, a privacy feature Arthur Pendham insisted on. I picked up a black marker. The smell of the ink hit me, a scent of nostalgia and power. I didn't erase their work. I simply drew a box around the flawed section of the code. Then, to the right, I wrote 6 lines of new code. It was a patch, a bridge that bypassed the linear blockage and looped the data back through a secondary verification node. It was simple, it was clean, it was beautiful. I capped the marker, put it back in the tray, and finished mopping the floor. I left the building at 5 in the morning, vanishing into the gray dawn like I always did. I didn't expect anything to happen. I assumed they would come in, wipe the board, and continue their failure. I was wrong. The next night, as I swiped my badge at the service entrance, the red light beeped. Access denied. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. Had they found out? Was I fired? Before I could turn to leave, 2 men in dark suits stepped out from the security office. They didn't look like mall cops. They looked like the Secret Service. "Are you Aurora?" one of them asked. "Yes," I stammered, clutching Stella tighter against my chest beneath my coat. "I am sorry if I did something wrong. I can leave. I won't come back." "Mr. Pendham wants to see you," the man said. He didn't grab me, but his posture made it clear that declining was not an option. They escorted me not to the exit, but to the private elevator. We shot up 45 floors in silence. My heart was hammering against Stella's back. I was terrified. Arthur Pendham was known for suing people who looked at him the wrong way. Had I violated a non-disclosure agreement by reading the board? The elevator doors opened directly into his office. It was dark, lit only by the glow of a dozen monitors and the city lights outside. Arthur Pendham stood by the window. He was a small man, older than he looked in photos, with wild gray hair and a spine curved slightly from decades of hunching over keyboards. He turned around. He held a tablet in his hand. He looked at the men. "Leave us." They hesitated. Looking at me, a disheveled woman in a cleaning uniform with a suspicious lump under her coat. "She is not an assassin, unless she plans to kill me with floor wax." Arthur snapped, "Get out." The doors closed. It was just me, the billionaire, and the sleeping baby. Arthur walked up to me. He didn't say hello. He held up the tablet. It displayed a photo of the whiteboard from the morning. "Who is your ghostwriter?" he demanded. His voice was raspy, like dry leaves. "I don't understand," I whispered. "Don't play stupid with me." He barked. "I have a team of 30 engineers. All of them have degrees from MIT and Stanford. None of them could solve the latency issue in the Janus project. This morning, I walked in and found a fix scribbled on the wall in the handwriting of a left-handed person. I checked the logs. The only person in that room between the engineers leaving and me arriving was the cleaning lady." He stepped closer, peering at me over the rim of his spectacles. "So, I will ask you again. Who told you what to write? Did you steal it? Did a competitor pay you to sabotage it?" "No," I said, my voice rising. "It wasn't sabotage. It was a fix. Your engineers were trying to parse the data sequentially. That creates a bottleneck. I just redirected the flow using a recursive loop. It is basic logic." Arthur froze. He stared at me for a long, uncomfortable minute. Then he looked at the lump under my coat. "What is that?" He pointed a bony finger at my chest. I took a deep breath and unzipped the top of my jumpsuit. Stella's head popped out, her eyes blinking against the light. "This is my daughter," I said defiantly, "and she is the reason I'm here cleaning your floors instead of sleeping. And yes, I wrote the code. I didn't steal it. I wrote it because your team was missing the obvious, and it was annoying me. Arthur Pendham did not smile. He did not coo at the baby. He walked back to his desk and sat down. You say it is basic logic, he muttered. He typed something on his keyboard. A large monitor on the wall flickered to life. It showed a black screen with a single blinking cursor. If you are a genius hiding in a janitor's uniform, prove it. He pointed to a laptop sitting on the corner of his desk. That is an encrypted hard drive from a defunct server we acquired last week. It uses a polymorphic encryption key that changes every 60 seconds. My security team says it will take 6 months to brute force it. He looked at his watch. It was a Patek Philippe that probably cost more than the hospital where I gave birth. You have 24 hours. You can sit there. You can use that laptop. If you crack it, I will give you a job, a real job. If you fail, or if you walk out that door, I will have you arrested for corporate espionage for touching my whiteboard. It was a trap. It was blackmail. But it was also a door opening. I didn't hesitate. I walked to the desk. Can I have some coffee? I asked. Arthur grunted and pointed to a machine in the corner. I sat down. I put Stella on the floor on top of my coat, making a small nest for her. I cracked my knuckles. I looked at the screen. The next 24 hours were a blur of agony and ecstasy. I did not sleep. I barely blinked. The encryption was vicious. It was designed to eat itself if you made a wrong move. It was a living puzzle. Stella woke up 3 times. I nursed her with one hand while typing with the other. I rocked her with my foot while my eyes scanned lines of hexadecimal code. Arthur stayed in the room the entire time. He didn't help. He sat at his own desk, working, occasionally watching me with the intensity of a scientist observing a lab rat. At hour 18, my vision started to swim. I was hallucinating. I saw Bradley's face in the code, laughing at me. I saw my father's face, telling me I was worthless. No, I whispered to the screen. Not this time. I found the pattern. It wasn't in the code itself. It was in the timing of the shifts. The key didn't change randomly. It changed based on the Fibonacci sequence. It was elegant, and it was breakable. I wrote a script to predict the next shift. I synced the attack. At hour 23, with 50 minutes to spare. I hit the enter key. The screen flashed green. A file directory popped up. Access granted. I slumped back in the leather chair, my body trembling with exhaustion. Arthur stood up. He walked over and looked at the screen. He scrolled through the files. He didn't say well done. He didn't clap. He looked at me. His eyes were not warm, but they were no longer looking at a janitor. They were looking at an equal. You are wasting your time scrubbing floors. Ms. Waverly, he said. He knew my name. Of course he knew my name. He was Arthur Pendham. He probably knew my blood type by now. Go home, he said. Shower, sleep, come back on Monday at 9 o'clock in the morning. Do not wear that jumpsuit. I stood up, my legs shaking. I picked up Stella, who was awake and watching him with wide eyes. What is the job? I asked, my voice hoarse. Arthur turned back to his window, looking out at the city he practically owned. You are my new intern, he said, and if you survive me for 6 months, you will be the most dangerous woman in this city. Now get out. You smell like bleach. I walked out of that office into the morning sun. I was still poor. I was still tired. But as I walked down the street, holding my daughter, I knew the wind had changed. The monster in the tower hadn't eaten me. He had given me a sword, and I was going to sharpen it until it could cut through anything, including the past. The elevator ride to the 45th floor felt different when I was not wearing a janitor's uniform. On my first official day as an intern at Pendham Tech, I wore a charcoal gray suit I had found at a consignment shop. I had spent the entire Sunday tailoring it by hand, stitching the seams until it fit my frame with the precision of armor. I pulled my red hair back into a severe bun and applied a shade of lipstick that was not quite red, not quite brown, but the color of dried blood. I was no longer Aurora Waverly, the discarded daughter. I was Aurora V. That was the name on my badge. The letter V stood for nothing and everything. It was a jagged edge. It was a valley. It was a victory. The corporate world of high-end technology is a jungle. But unlike the actual wilderness, the predators here wear Italian loafers and smile while they dismantle you. I was 21 years old, a single mother living in a studio apartment that still smelled of damp plaster. But I walked into that office with the stride of a woman who owned the building. I had to. If they smelled weakness, they would eat me alive. My colleagues were the best and brightest graduates from Ivy League universities. They were boys named Chad and William, who talked loudly about their summer homes in the Hamptons and their stock portfolios. They looked at me with curiosity. I was the enigma. I was the hire that had come from nowhere, handpicked by the emperor himself. They asked me where I went to school. I was homeschooled. I lied smoothly. My education was private. They assumed that meant I was rich. They assumed I was one of them. I let them believe it. I never mentioned that my private education happened in a public library at 3 o'clock in the morning. I never mentioned that while they were rushing fraternities, I was rushing to change diapers between shifts at a diner. I kept my life as a mother completely compartmentalized. Stella was my heart. But in this glass tower, she was a liability. The corporate world does not respect mothers. It tolerates them, and barely. I could not afford tolerance. I needed respect. So I became a machine. I arrived at 6 o'clock in the morning. I left at 10 o'clock at night. I coded with a ferocity that frightened the other interns. To them, code was a job. To me, it was the ladder out of hell. Arthur Pendham watched it all. He was not a kind man. He did not offer praise. He offered criticism that could peel the skin off your ego. But he was the father I had never had. Jonathan Waverly had taught me how to hold a fork properly. Arthur Pendham taught me how to hold a room hostage with silence. One afternoon, 6 months into my tenure, I was sitting in his office reviewing a security protocol for a banking client. "This code is efficient," Arthur said, tossing the tablet onto his desk. "But it is naive." "Naive?" I asked, bristling. "It blocks 99% of known intrusion vectors." Arthur spun his chair around to face me. "You are thinking like an engineer. V. You need to think like a sociopath. You assume the attacker wants the money. What if the attacker just wants to burn the bank down? You cannot build a wall if you do not understand the nature of the barbarian at the gate." He stood up and walked to the window. "Business is not about building the best product," he said, his voice low. "It is about leverage. It is about finding the one thing your opponent cannot afford to lose and holding it in your hand. You have a good brain for logic, Aurora, but you need to develop a stomach for violence, not physical violence, economic violence, reputation violence. When someone strikes you, you do not just block the blow, you break the arm." I absorbed his lessons like a sponge. I began to look at the world differently. I stopped seeing people as friends or enemies. I saw them as variables in an equation. Some were constants. Some were erratic. All of them could be manipulated if you knew the source code of their desires. My ascent was vertical. In 2 years, I went from intern to junior developer to senior systems architect. Then, just after my 23rd birthday, I was named project lead for the quantum division. It was unheard of. The whispers in the break room were vicious. They said I was sleeping with the old man. They said I was a diversity hire. I ignored them. I let my work speak, and my paycheck screamed. The first time I saw a bonus check with 5 zeros on it, I almost vomited. I sat in my car in the parking garage and stared at the piece of paper. It was more money than I had earned in 5 years of scrubbing toilets. It was freedom. I didn't buy a sports car. I didn't buy designer clothes. I bought a fortress. I purchased a 2-bedroom condominium in a building with 24-hour security, a concierge, and elevators that required a key card. It wasn't the sprawling estate I grew up in, but it was mine. It had heating that worked. It had no cockroaches. It had a view of the lake that didn't include a brick wall. I moved Stella in on a Saturday. She was 3 years old now, a bright, observant child with my red hair and a seriousness that broke my heart. "Is this our house?" she asked, standing in the middle of the empty living room, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Yes, baby," I said, kneeling down to hug her. "This is our house. Nobody can kick us out, ever." I enrolled her in a private Montessori school. It was expensive, the kind of place where the tuition cost more than the average national salary, but it was different from the stifling, status-obsessed atmosphere of St. Jude's. Here, the teachers encouraged curiosity. They didn't care who her grandfather was. They cared that she could read at a fifth-grade level when she was only 4. Stella was my anchor. When I came home late, my brain frying from 12 hours of staring at screens, she would be there. She never complained. It was as if she understood, even at that young age, that we were soldiers in a war she couldn't see. "Mommy is building a castle," she told her teacher once, "to keep the dragons away." She didn't know how right she was. The dragons came for me when I was 25. I was leading the development of Project Chimera, a revolutionary encryption algorithm that would make Pendum Tech the gatekeeper of global financial data. It was a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The pressure was atmospheric. 3 weeks before the launch, disaster struck. I arrived at the office to find the servers wiped, the backup drives were corrupted, and a rival firm, Nexus Dynamics, had just announced a press conference to unveil a new product that sounded suspiciously identical to Chimera. Panic erupted on the floor. Men twice my age were shouting, blaming each other, sweating through their dress shirts. The stock price began to wobble in pre-market trading. I stood in the center of the chaos, perfectly still. I closed my eyes. I breathed in. I breathed out. I went to my office and locked the door. I didn't try to restore the data. That was gone. I knew someone on the inside had sold us out. A physical breach was impossible. It had to be an authorized user. I pulled up the logs, not the server logs, which had been scrubbed, but the printer logs, the cafeteria payment logs, the keycard access logs. I cross-referenced the timestamps. It took me 2 hours to find the anomaly. David Suter, a mid-level engineer who had been complaining about his salary for months. He had accessed the server room at 4 a.m, claiming he left his gym bag, but the cafeteria logs showed he had bought 2 coffees 10 minutes later. Who buys 2 coffees at 4 a.m. when they are alone? He didn't. He bought one for himself and one for the courier from Nexus Dynamics. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I called Arthur. "I found the leak." I said, "Handle it," he replied. "Show me you are ready." I walked out to the main floor. David Suter was sitting at his desk, pretending to look frantic like everyone else. "David," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. "Come with me." He looked up, startled. His eyes darted to the exit. "Now," I said. I took him to the conference room, the same glass room where I had rewritten the code on the whiteboard years ago. I sat him down. I didn't yell. I placed a single sheet of paper in front of him. It was a printout of his bank transfer from a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Dated yesterday. I traced the packet routing. I lied. "I know you sold the source code." David turned pale. "Look, V, I have debts. My wife is sick. They offered me—" "I don't care," I interrupted. I leaned forward. "Here is what is going to happen. You are going to log into your contact at Nexus Dynamics. You are going to tell them you forgot to upload the final patch, the one that stabilizes the kernel. You are going to send them this file." I slid a USB drive across the table. "What is it?" he whispered. "It is a poison pill." I said, "It looks like the patch, but once it integrates with their system, it will execute a dormant command. It will not just delete our code from their servers. It will brick their entire hardware infrastructure. It will melt their processors. They will not be able to launch a calculator, let alone a rival product." He stared at me in horror. "That is illegal. That is destruction of property." "And what you did is corporate espionage," I countered. "You have 2 choices. David, option A. You send the file, then you resign. I will not press charges. You will walk away, but you will never work in this industry again. Option B. I call the FBI. You go to federal prison for 10 years. And while you are there, I will make sure everyone knows you are the reason the company went under. He took the USB drive. His hands were shaking so hard, he dropped it twice. He sent the file. 6 hours later, Nexus Dynamics had to cancel their press conference due to catastrophic technical difficulties. Their stock plummeted 30% in an hour. Pendum Tech's stock soared. I fired David 10 minutes after the file was sent. I didn't shake his hand. I just told security to escort him out. That evening, I was summoned to the penthouse office. Arthur was sitting in his leather chair, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. The room was dark, illuminated only by the city skyline. They say Nexus has lost 3 years of research, Arthur said softly. Their board is calling for the CEO's resignation. They shouldn't have stolen from us, I said, taking the seat opposite him. Arthur swirled his drink. You were ruthless, Aurora. You didn't just defend the castle. You salted the earth so nothing would ever grow there again. I learned from the best, I replied. He nodded slowly, then he coughed. It was a wet, rattling sound that seemed to come from deep within his chest. He took a handkerchief and wiped his mouth. When he pulled it away, I saw a speck of red. He saw me looking. He didn't hide it. I am dying. Aurora, he said. The words hung in the air. I felt a cold clamp around my heart. Pancreatic cancer, he continued. Stage 4. The doctors give me a year, maybe 18 months if I stop drinking, which I will not do. Arthur, I started. He held up a hand. Do not give me sympathy. I hate sympathy. It is a useless emotion. He leaned forward, the light from the window casting deep shadows on his face. I have no children. I have no wife. I have an empire worth $4 billion and a board of directors who are vultures waiting for my carcass to hit the ground. They want to chop this company up and sell it for parts. He looked me in the eye. I need an heir. Aurora, not someone who shares my DNA, someone who shares my mind, someone who can look at a problem and not see a tragedy, but a puzzle. Someone who can fire a man and then go home and sleep like a baby because it was the necessary move. He placed his hand on a thick leather folder on his desk. I have been watching you. I have been testing you. Today was the final exam. You passed. He pushed the folder toward me. This is the succession plan. It is a secret. If the board finds out, they will try to oust me before I die. You are going to be the CEO of Pendum Tech. But first, you have to help me prepare the battlefield. I looked at the folder. Then I looked at the old man who had saved me from the abyss. Why me? I asked. Why not one of the veterans? Why not a polished executive? Because you are hungry, Arthur said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, and because you have a scar. People who have never been wounded are dangerous in business. They are soft. They break when they get hit. You were broken a long time ago. You calcified. You are harder than any of them. He raised his glass. To Phoenix, he said. I picked up the folder. It was heavy. It felt like the weight of the world. But as I held it, I realized something. I wasn't afraid. The girl who froze in the snow was gone. I raised my imaginary glass. To the future, I said. And outside, the lights of Chicago twinkled below us, oblivious to the fact that the city was about to belong to the woman it had once tried to kill. The next 5 years were a masterclass in controlled acceleration. If my 20s were about survival, my early 30s were about dominance. I did not just work for Pendum Tech anymore. I became its central nervous system. I founded Aura Security, a subsidiary focused on high-level corporate defense and offensive cyber warfare. It started as a pet project, a small division with 10 engineers, but within 18 months, it was generating 40% of the group's total revenue. When Arthur formally merged Aura Security back into the parent company, my personal stock options vested, and I became a multimillionaire overnight. I remember staring at the bank balance on my phone screen. It was a number with 2 commas. A few years ago, I had dug through couch cushions looking for quarters to buy milk. Now, I could buy the dairy farm. But strangely, the money didn't make me giddy. It made me calm. It was a layer of insulation, thick and impenetrable, between me and the world that had once tried to freeze me to death. But the most significant acquisition of those years was not a company or a stock portfolio. It was a person. I met Gabriel Stone on a Tuesday morning at the site of the new Pendam Data Center in Oregon. We were building a fortress in the mountains, a facility designed to house the world's most sensitive servers. I was there to inspect the physical security perimeters. He was there to design the landscape. I walked out of the construction trailer in my stilettos, holding a tablet, ready to tear apart the architect's plans. I saw a man kneeling in the mud, examining the root system of a Douglas fir. He was wearing work boots, jeans covered in soil, and a flannel shirt rolled up to the elbows. He didn't look up when I approached. "You are going to have to move that tree," I said, my voice cutting through the crisp mountain air. "It blocks the line of sight for the thermal cameras on the south wall." He stood up slowly. He was tall, with shoulders that suggested he actually lifted rocks for a living. Not just weights at a gym. He had dark hair dusted with sawdust and eyes the color of moss. He looked at the tree, then at the camera mount, then at me. "No," he said calmly. "Excuse me?" I asked, arching an eyebrow. I wasn't used to hearing that word. "The tree stays," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "The root system stabilizes the slope. If you remove it, the next heavy rain will cause a landslide that will take out your entire south wall. You can move the camera 10 feet to the left. The tree has been here for 80 years. It has seniority." I stared at him. He wasn't arrogant. He was just right. That was Gabriel. He was an anchor. In my world of shifting codes, virtual realities, and fleeting stock prices, Gabriel dealt in earth, stone, and time. He was a landscape architect who saw the world not as something to be conquered, but something to be cultivated. We didn't have a whirlwind romance. We had a slow, steady convergence. He didn't care about my title. He didn't care about the rumors that I was Arthur Pendam's Ice Queen. He saw the woman who checked her phone every 5 minutes to make sure her daughter was okay. And Stella adored him. Stella was 10 years old now, a whip-smart girl who had inherited my curiosity and, thankfully, none of her biological father's flakiness. One afternoon, Gabriel came over to our condo. He didn't bring flowers for me. He brought a terrarium kit for Stella. He sat on the floor with her for 3 hours, explaining how the charcoal filtered the water and how the moss created its own ecosystem. "You have to be patient, Stella," he told her, his large hands guiding her small ones as she placed a fern. "You can't force things to grow. You have to create the right environment and then trust them to find their way." I watched them from the kitchen doorway, a glass of wine in my hand, and felt a lump in my throat. I had spent so long building walls to keep people out. Gabriel was the first person who didn't try to break them down. He simply planted a garden around them. He knew about my past. I told him everything one night. The blizzard, the suitcase, the pregnancy, Bradley. I expected him to look at me with pity. Instead, he took my hand and kissed the knuckles. "You are not a victim, Aurora," he said softly. "You are a survivor. And I am proud of you, with Gabriel and Stella safe in my corner." I turned my eyes toward the one thing I still lacked, a kingdom of my own. I began looking for a permanent residence. I wanted land. I wanted privacy. I wanted a fortress. I found a 10-acre estate on the North Shore. A sprawling property with an old stone manor that had fallen into disrepair. It was magnificent. It was also the subject of a fierce legal battle. A commercial developer wanted to bulldoze the manor and turn the land into luxury condos. The lawyer representing the developer, fighting to invalidate the historical preservation status of the house, was none other than the Honorable Jonathan Waverly, my father. I saw his name on the legal briefs and felt a cold, predatory smile spread across my face. He was still the same man, using his knowledge of the law to destroy history for a paycheck. He had no idea who was bidding against his client. To him, the opposing buyer was just a shell company named Polaris LLC. I didn't hire a lawyer. I hired a team of 3 land use attorneys and instructed them to bury my father's client in paperwork. We found environmental endangered species on the property. We found zoning inconsistencies from 1920. We dragged the process out for 6 months. Finally, the developer ran out of cash and patience. They withdrew. I bought the estate for $12 million in cash. My father lost the case. He lost his contingency fee, and he had absolutely no idea that the anonymous buyer, who had just humiliated him in court, was the daughter he had thrown out into the snow. I moved us in during the autumn. As I drove through the iron gates, I looked at the security shack. I made a mental note to upgrade the cameras. I was not building a home. I was building a sanctuary. While I was rising, the house of Waverly was beginning to crumble. I didn't intervene. I simply watched. I had set up Google alerts for my parents' names years ago, and now the notifications were becoming frequent and scandalous. Jonathan Waverly was under investigation. It wasn't public yet, but the legal circles were buzzing. There were rumors of bribes taken to dismiss DUI charges for the sons of wealthy donors. There were whispers about a judicial ethics committee inquiry. He was still a judge, but the invitations to high society galas were drying up, and my mother, poor Catherine, was trying to patch the leaking hull of their reputation with diamond-encrusted Band-Aids. I saw a listing on an auction site for a vintage emerald necklace, Waverly Collection. It was her favorite piece. She used to wear it to the opera. Now, it was being sold to pay for what? Legal fees? Hush money? Or just to maintain the illusion that they were still solvent? Gabriel caught me looking at the listing one night. "You could buy it," he said. "Give it back to her." I closed the laptop. "No, they sold me out a long time ago. They can sell their jewelry now. It is the law of equivalent exchange." I was cold. I knew I was cold. But Arthur Pendham had taught me that mercy is a luxury you can only afford when the enemy is completely neutralized. And they were not neutralized yet. Speaking of Arthur, the end came sooner than we expected. The cancer moved with the efficiency of a well-written virus. Within 6 months of his diagnosis, Arthur was confined to his penthouse. He refused to go to a hospital. He wanted to die where he had lived, surrounded by screens and the hum of servers. I spent every evening by his bedside. We didn't talk about feelings. We talked about the future of AI. We talked about the pending acquisition of a silicon chip manufacturer in Taiwan. On his final night, the room was quiet. The nurse had dimmed the lights. Arthur was frail, his skin like parchment paper, but his eyes were still sharp. "Aurora," he rasped, "I am here. Arthur, do not let them turn this company into a democracy," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Innovation is not democratic. It is a dictatorship of the intellect. You hold the line. I will." I promised. He looked at me, and for the first time in 10 years, his guard dropped completely. "You were the best investment I ever made," he said. He closed his eyes. An hour later, the monitors flatlined. I didn't cry in the room. I stood up, straightened my blazer, and called the legal team. There would be time to mourn later. Right now, there was a corporation to secure. The funeral was a spectacle. Senators, tech moguls, and rivals who hated him all showed up to give eulogies about what a visionary he was. I sat in the front row, wearing black sunglasses, holding Gabriel's hand. I saw my father there, in the back, trying to network with a senator. He looked older, grayer, and desperate. He didn't see me. The reading of the will took place 2 days later in the boardroom of Pendham Tech. The table was full. There were the members of the board of directors, men in $3,000 suits who were practically salivating. There were Arthur's distant cousins who hadn't spoken to him in 20 years. There were representatives from charities hoping for a windfall. The executor of the estate, a stoic lawyer named Mr. Sterling, opened the heavy leather binder. He cleared his throat. "I, Arthur Pendham, being of sound mind and body, hereby revoke all prior wills and codicils." He began. The room leaned forward. "To my distant relatives, the cousins and nephews listed in Appendix A, I leave the sum of $1 each, so that you cannot claim I forgot you." A murmur of outrage rippled through the back of the room. "To the board of directors, I leave my gratitude for your service, and my advice to update your resumes." The chairman of the board stood up, his face red. "What is the meaning of this?" "Mr. Sterling raised a hand. "Please, let me finish." He turned the page. "To Aurora Waverly, my protégée, my partner, and the daughter of my spirit." I felt Gabriel squeeze my hand under the table. My heart was pounding. Not with greed, but with the sheer magnitude of the moment. "I leave the entirety of my estate. This includes 100% of my shares in Pendum Tech, my real estate holdings, my intellectual property rights, and my personal liquid assets. She is the sole heir." Silence. Absolute. Vacuum-sealed silence. Then, chaos. The chairman was shouting about undue influence. The cousins were screaming about lawsuits. "Mr. Sterling simply slid a thick document across the table toward me. "It is ironclad. Ms. Waverly," he said quietly, ignoring the noise around us. We filmed the signing. We had 3 independent psychiatrists certify his mental state. He spent the last 5 years preparing this to be unassailable. I looked at the document. $4 billion. Control of the most powerful cybersecurity firm in the hemisphere. I stood up. The room went quiet again. They were looking at the janitor. They were looking at the intern. They were looking at the woman who now owned them. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice steady, "you have 2 choices. You can sue me, in which case I will tie you up in court until your grandchildren are old, and I will release the internal audits of your expense accounts in the meantime. Or you can sit down, shut up, and let me run this company the way Arthur wanted." I looked at the chairman. "Sit down, Bob." Bob sat down. I walked out of the boardroom, my hand in Gabriel's. We took the elevator down to the lobby. The news hadn't broken yet. The world didn't know that the homeless girl was now a billionaire. I looked at my reflection in the glass doors. I saw the sharp lines of my blazer, the confident set of my jaw. But underneath, I saw the fire that had started in a blizzard 15 years ago. It wasn't a flicker anymore. It was an inferno. "Let's go home." "Gabriel," I said, "I have a birthday party to plan for Stella." And I had a reckoning to prepare for the Waverleys. The chessboard was finally set, and the queen had just taken the throne. Wealth, true wealth, is silent. It is the submarine beneath the waves, not the flashy destroyer on the surface. While the business pages were frantically speculating about who would take the reins of the Pendum Empire following Arthur's death. The transfer of power had already happened in a windowless room with 3 lawyers and a notary. The public knew that Arthur Pendum had died. What they did not know, and what I paid a great deal of money to keep out of the headlines for a few more weeks, was that his entire fortune had passed to a woman named Aurora 5. I went to work as usual. I sat in Arthur's chair. I signed the documents, but outside the hermetically sealed glass walls of my office, the world of the Waverleys was finally, spectacularly, catching fire. It started with a leak, not a data leak, but a leak of confidence. The investigation into the Honorable Judge Jonathan Waverly, which had been simmering for months, finally boiled over. It wasn't just the bribery, it was the arrogance. He had made enemies on his climb up the ladder, and now that his grip was slipping, those enemies were stomping on his fingers. The Illinois Bar Association didn't just disbar him, they made an example of him. I read the transcript of the hearing while drinking my morning espresso. They stripped him of his license to practice law, citing moral turpitude and gross misconduct. For a man like my father, who wore his title like a second skin, this was a castration. He wasn't just unemployed, he was unmade. Then came the financial tsunami. It turned out that my parents had been living on credit for the last decade, borrowing against the equity of the house to fund galas and country club memberships. When the income stopped, the house of cards collapsed. The foreclosure was brutal. I didn't have to imagine it. I had a front row seat. I had hired a photographer to document the day the sheriff's deputies arrived at the Waverly estate. I sat in my office and clicked through the high-resolution images. There was my mother, Catherine, clutching a porcelain vase, screaming at a moving man who was loading her French velvet sofa into a truck. There was Jonathan, standing on the lawn in his dressing gown, looking small and confused, as a deputy taped an eviction notice to the mahogany door he had once slammed in my face. They lost everything. The cars were repossessed. The art was seized. The friends they had spent a lifetime impressing evaporated like mist. When you are a social climber, you realize too late that the people at the top only tolerate you as long as you are useful. The moment you smell of failure, you are quarantined. They moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that they would have previously driven through with their doors locked. It was a place where the hallways smelled of boiled cabbage and cigarette smoke, and the sirens wailed all night long. But before I could deal with them, I had a loose end to tie up. Bradley. I had almost forgotten he existed. He was a footnote in my history, a painful lesson in the cost of naivety. But cockroaches have a way of surviving nuclear winters, and Bradley had survived his own mediocrity. He found me on a Tuesday. I was leaving the Pendham Tower. Walking toward my waiting car, I was flanked by 2 security guards. But Bradley, fueled by liquid courage and desperation, managed to lunge out from behind a concrete pillar. "Aurora!" he shouted. I stopped. I turned my head. He looked like a bad cover song of his former self. His hair was thinning and greasy. His face was puffy, the skin red and blotchy from years of cheap alcohol. He was wearing a leather jacket that was peeling at the elbows. He stared at me, his eyes widening as he took in my tailored suit, the diamond studs in my ears, the sheer aura of power that surrounded me. "I saw you in the magazine," he slurred, pointing a shaking finger. "I saw you in Wired. You are the V everyone talks about? You?" I didn't speak. I just looked at him with the clinical detachment of a scientist examining a specimen. "You owe me." "Aurora," he spat, stepping closer. "I made you. I gave you a place to stay when you were nothing. And now you are rich? You are going to cut me a check. Or else what?" I asked. My voice was calm, contrasting sharply with his manic energy. "Or else I go to the press," he sneered. "I tell them about the pregnant teen runaway. I tell them about the rat-infested basement. I tell them you are not a genius. Just a charity case I took pity on. How will that look for your stock price?" I sighed. It was such a small, unimaginative threat. "Bradley," I said softly, "you are operating under a misconception. You think I care what people think of me." I nodded to the head of my security detail, a man named Marcus who was 6 feet 4 inches of muscle and silence. "Remove him," I said. Marcus didn't punch him. That would have been a lawsuit. He simply stepped forward, applied a pressure hold to Bradley's shoulder that dropped him to his knees instantly, and ushered him into a waiting, unmarked van. "Where are you taking me?" Bradley shrieked as he was dragged away. "To a detox center 3 counties over," I said to myself as I got into my car. "The admission is paid for 30 days. Consider it my final act of charity." It took 5 minutes. He was gone. He was deleted. I checked my phone and answered an email about a merger before the car even pulled out of the garage. My parents, however, were not going to be solved with a rehab stint. Desperation makes people creative, but it also makes them delusional. Sitting in their cramped apartment, listening to the neighbors argue through paper-thin walls, Jonathan and Catherine Waverly hatched a plan. They had run out of jewelry to sell. Jonathan's pension was frozen pending the investigation. They were staring at a future of food stamps and Medicaid. Then, they remembered me. They didn't remember me with love. They didn't wonder if I was happy. They remembered me as an asset they had misplaced. "We should have kept tabs on her," Jonathan grumbled, pacing the worn linoleum floor of their kitchenette. "She was a resourceful girl," Catherine added, polishing a tarnished silver spoon she had managed to hide from the bankruptcy court. "She must have landed on her feet. Someone with her looks she probably married well." That was their logic. They could not conceive of a world where I made my own fortune. In their misogynistic, archaic worldview, a woman's wealth was always a reflection of the man standing next to her. They scraped together their last $500 and hired a private investigator. He was a bottom feeder named Slattery who worked out of a strip mall. He wasn't good enough to crack my encrypted personal data, but he was good enough to follow a paper trail of public records. He found my address. He didn't find the name of the owner, because the deed was held by a blind trust. He just found that Aurora Waverly was receiving mail at the Stone Manor on the North Shore. I can imagine the scene when he delivered the news. The Stone Manor? Catherine must have gasped. That is the old Vanderbilt estate. It is worth tens of millions. She must have married a hedge fund manager. Jonathan would have concluded, his eyes lighting up with greed, or an oil baron. They didn't see a daughter. They saw a bank machine. We will go to her, Jonathan decided, putting on his only remaining suit, which was now slightly too loose for his stress-thinned frame. We are her parents. The law, and society, dictates that children care for their aging parents. It is our right. They believed it. They truly, deeply believed that despite throwing me into a blizzard, despite calling me a cancer, they were entitled to the fruits of my survival. They convinced themselves that their cruelty had been tough love that pushed me to succeed. Therefore, they reasoned, they were responsible for my success. They drove to the North Shore in a rusted sedan they had bought after the Mercedes was towed. It must have been a painful drive, passing the exits to their old life, driving deeper into the enclave of wealth they were now exiled from. I was in the garden with Gabriel and Stella when the alert came through. It was a Saturday afternoon. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. We were preparing for Stella's 10th birthday party, which was starting in 2 hours. The caterers were setting up a tent. Gabriel was adjusting the final placement of a trellis of white roses. Stella was running around with the dogs, her laughter ringing out like a bell. My phone buzzed. It was the dedicated line for the security gate. Ms. Waverly. The voice of the head guard crackled in my ear. Go ahead, Mike. We have a situation at the North Gate, he said. There are 2 individuals here, a male and a female. They are driving a vehicle that is leaking oil on the driveway. They are demanding to see you. Who are they? I asked, though I already knew. They say they are your parents, Mike said. The man is quite agitated. He keeps shouting that he is a judge and that I am obstructing justice. He says they are here to collect you. I looked across the lawn. Gabriel caught my eye. He saw the tension in my shoulders. He put down his shears and walked over. Is it them? He asked quietly. I nodded. Do you want me to send them away? He asked. I can have Mike tell them you don't live here. I looked at Stella. She was 10 years old, the exact age I was when I first started realizing my parents didn't love me. But she was happy. She was safe. She was loved. I looked back at the gatehouse in the distance. No, I said, let them in. Gabriel looked surprised. Are you sure? I am sure, I said, a cold smile touching my lips. But don't bring them to the house. Have Mike escort them to the guest holding area near the stables, the one with the glass walls. I want them to see. Gabriel, I want them to see everything. I spoke into the phone. Mike, let them in. Treat them like unexpected vendors. Escort them to the waiting pavilion, and make sure they don't touch anything. Copy that. Ms. Waverly. I hung up the phone. Why the stables? Gabriel asked. Because, I said, smoothing the lapel of my silk blazer, I want them to understand their position. They are not guests. They are petitioners. And before I destroy them, I want them to see exactly what they threw away. I walked toward the house to check my makeup. I wanted to look perfect. I wanted to look expensive. I wanted to look like the storm that was coming to wash them away. They thought they were coming to bully a daughter. They had no idea they were walking into the lion's den, and the lion was hungry. The garden that Gabriel had designed for Stella's 10th birthday was a masterpiece of biological engineering and aesthetic grace. It was not just a backyard. It was a living, breathing ecosystem that spanned 3 acres of the estate. He had imported Japanese maples that were currently exploding in shades of crimson and gold. And he had constructed a waterfall that cascaded into a koi pond filled with fish that cost more than my first car. The air smelled of jasmine and roasting truffle-infused beef from the catering tent. The guest list was a curated selection of the people who actually ran the world. The governor of Illinois was over by the bar, laughing at a joke told by the CEO of a major semiconductor firm. The founder of the largest social media platform in the world was sitting on a picnic blanket, helping Stella build a Lego castle. It was a scene of absolute power masked as a casual afternoon gathering. I stood on the terrace, watching them. I was wearing a silk jumpsuit in emerald green, a color chosen deliberately to clash with the pale, washed-out memories of my childhood. Around my neck hung a simple diamond solitaire, a stone so clear it looked like a drop of frozen water. I took a sip of champagne. It was crisp, cold, and tasted of victory. Then my earpiece buzzed. "They are secured in the North Pavilion," Mike said. His voice was tight. He didn't like letting trash onto the property, even under orders. "I will be right there," I replied. Gabriel walked up behind me. He placed a warm hand on the small of my back. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. "The guests are asking for you. We can have the police remove them." "No," I said, turning to look at him. "If the police remove them, they become victims. They become the poor, elderly parents harassed by their rich, heartless daughter. I need to kill the narrative before it breathes. I need them to understand that they are not fighting a daughter. They are fighting a god." I handed him my champagne glass. "Keep an eye on Stella. If she asks, tell her Mommy went to deal with a vendor." I walked away from the music and the laughter. I walked down the gravel path that led away from the main house, past the rose gardens, to the glass-walled waiting pavilion near the service entrance. It was a structure we used for delivery drivers or contractors waiting for clearance. It was climate-controlled and clean, but it was sterile. It was a fishbowl. As I approached, I saw them through the glass. Time is a cruel sculptor, but it is especially brutal to those who lack the funds to bribe it. Jonathan Waverly was pacing the small room. His suit was a charcoal pinstripe that I recognized from my childhood, but it was now shiny at the elbows and hung loosely on his frame. His posture, once the rigid spine of the judiciary, was slumped. He looked like a man who was constantly looking over his shoulder. Catherine sat on a plastic chair, clutching a handbag that had been fashionable 10 years ago. Her blonde hair, once impeccably dyed and coiffed, was showing gray roots that extended an inch from her scalp. She was looking around the room, assessing the cost of the light fixtures, calculating the value of the floor tiles. I stopped at the door. I took a deep breath. I let the coldness that Arthur Pendham had cultivated in me flood my veins. I was not 15 anymore. I was not the girl in the snow. I signaled to the guard. He opened the door. I stepped inside. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. They looked up. At first, there was no recognition. They saw a tall, striking woman with red hair and eyes that could cut glass. They saw the emerald silk. They saw the shoes that cost $2,000. They saw the way I held myself, not with the deference of a child, but with the authority of a queen entering her throne room. Then, Catherine gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Aurora?" she whispered. Jonathan stopped pacing. He squinted at me, his eyes narrowing as he tried to reconcile the shivering teenager he had exiled with the titan standing before him. I didn't smile. I didn't offer a hug. I didn't say hello. I simply stood there, flanked by 2 armed security guards who looked like they were carved out of granite. "So," Jonathan said, his voice cracking slightly before he found his old booming baritone, "you are alive." I stared at him. "We heard rumors," he continued, trying to inflate his chest, trying to reclaim the space. "We heard you had done well for yourself. I told your mother. I said, 'Catherine, the girl has the Waverly blood. She is resilient.'" He took a step toward me. "It is a fine property. Aurora, a very fine property. Who is the owner? Is it your husband? Is he here? We would like to meet him. It is only proper that he meets his parents-in-law." He was doing it. He was rewriting history in real time. He was erasing the blizzard. He was erasing the empty suitcase. He was constructing a reality where I was simply a wayward child who had finally settled down with a wealthy man. And he was the benevolent patriarch coming to inspect the union. I looked at Catherine. She was already crying. But they weren't the tears of a mother who had missed her child. I knew those tears. I had seen them 1,000 times when she wanted a new car, or when she wanted to get out of a speeding ticket. They were tactical tears. "Oh, my baby," she sobbed, standing up and reaching out her arms. "Look at you. You are so beautiful. We have missed you so much, every day. We prayed for you." She took a step toward me. "Do not touch me," I said. My voice was not loud. It was not a scream. It was a flat, monochromatic command. Catherine froze. Her hands hovered in the air, trembling. Jonathan's face darkened. The veneer of the friendly father slipped, revealing the bully beneath. "Now see here, Aurora," he snapped. "Is that how you speak to your mother? After all these years? We traveled all the way here to see you. We are family, and we are in a bit of a temporary situation. We have a right to expect some support from our daughter. A right?" I repeated. I walked further into the room. The heels of my shoes clicked against the polished concrete floor like gunshots. "You have a right?" I asked again, tilting my head. "Yes," Jonathan blustered. "The law creates an obligation, but beyond the law, there is moral duty. We raised you. We put a roof over your head for 15 years. We fed you. We clothed you. And now, when we are facing some legal misunderstandings, you are living in a palace. It is your duty to help us." I looked at him, really looked at him, and I realized something profound. I wasn't afraid of him. I wasn't angry at him. I was disgusted by him. He was a small, petty creature who thought the world owed him everything because of his last name. "I didn't invite you to sit down," I said, ignoring his speech. "I didn't offer you water. Do you know why?" Jonathan sputtered. "Because you are rude. Because you are ungrateful." "No," I said, "because I do not offer hospitality to strangers." "Strangers?" Catherine wailed. "I gave birth to you." I looked at her. "The woman who gave birth to me died 17 years ago." I said, "She died on a Tuesday night in January when she chose to arrange flowers instead of protecting her child. The man who raised me died the same night when he threw a suitcase at my head and told me to die in the snow." I took a step closer to Jonathan. I was tall in my heels, almost eye level with him now. "You told me not to come back until I had scrubbed the poverty off my soul," I recalled. Quoting him verbatim, "Well, look at me, Jonathan. Is my soul clean enough for you now, or is it too bright for your eyes?" Jonathan's face turned a shade of plum purple. He wasn't used to being challenged. In his courtroom, he held the gavel. In his house, he held the checkbook. He didn't know how to function in a world where he held nothing. "You listen to me, you little brat," he hissed, stepping into my personal space. "I don't care what you think you remember. I am your father, and I am in trouble. I need $500,000 for legal retainers, and I need it today. You will talk to your husband, or your boyfriend, or whoever is paying for this circus, and you will get me a check. If you don't, I will sue you for parental support. I will drag your name through the mud. I will tell the press what a heartless bitch you are." There it was. The mask was gone. The extortionist had arrived. I laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "You think I have a husband?" I asked. I gestured to the sprawling estate visible through the glass walls. I pointed to the security guards. I pointed to the diamond on my neck. "You think a man gave me this?" Jonathan sneered. "Don't be ridiculous. You were a C student who got expelled for hacking. You have no skills. Of course a man gave you this. You probably seduced some old fool. Just like that musician you ran off with." He raised his hand. It was a reflex. A muscle memory from a lifetime of controlling women with fear. He pulled his arm back to slap me. Just as he had done a dozen times when I was a child and spoke out of turn, he expected me to flinch. He expected me to cower. I didn't blink. Before his hand could move more than 6 inches, Marcus moved. It was a blur of motion. One moment Jonathan was standing. The next, his arm was twisted behind his back at an angle that made him scream in pain, and his face was pressed against the glass wall of the pavilion. "Jonathan!" Catherine screamed. "Don't break it, Marcus," I said calmly. He doesn't have health insurance anymore. Marcus held him there, pinned like a butterfly in a display case. Jonathan was gasping, his cheeks squashed against the glass, his eyes wide with shock. "You see, Jonathan," I said, leaning in close to his trapped face, "that is the difference between us. You use violence because you are weak. I use power because I own it." I turned to Catherine, who was trembling in the corner. "And you are wrong about the money," I said. I signaled to the other guard. He handed me a tablet. I tapped the screen and held it up for them to see. It was the deed to the estate. It was the incorporation papers of Pendham Tech. It was the list of the board of directors with my name at the top. Aurora Waverly, CEO and chairwoman. There is no husband, I said, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. There is no boyfriend. There is no sugar daddy. I looked at Jonathan's terrified eyes. I am the sugar daddy. I am the one who bought the bank that holds your mortgage. Jonathan. I am the one who owns the media conglomerate that is currently preparing the exclusive story on your disbarment, and I am the anonymous buyer who outbid your client for this land and made you look like an incompetent fool in court last year. Jonathan stopped struggling. He went limp in Marcus's grip. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just walked into a trap. He had walked into the lair of the creature he had created. I am the sole heir to the Pendham Empire. I continued, $4 billion. And do you know what the best part is? I didn't get it because of my last name. I got it because I was smarter, harder, and more ruthless than anyone else in the room. I learned that ruthlessness from you. So, in a way, you did help me. I nodded to Marcus. He released Jonathan, who slid to the floor, rubbing his shoulder, looking up at me with a mixture of awe and terror. Catherine looked at the tablet, then at me. Her eyes changed. The fear was replaced by a sudden, sickening hope. $4 billion? She breathed. Aurora, darling, if you have so much, surely you can spare a crumb for us? We are your family. We are your blood. I looked at her with pity. I have a family. I said, I have a daughter who thinks the stars were hung in the sky just for her. I have a partner who builds gardens instead of walls. You? You are just two people who share a genetic sequence with me. I turned to the door. You have 5 minutes to leave my property. I said, if you are still here in 6 minutes, I will have you arrested for trespassing. And Jonathan, given your current legal standing, I don't think you can afford another arrest. But we have nowhere to go, Catherine wailed, falling to her knees. I stopped at the door and looked back. I recall a bus stop on Highland and Main. I said, it has a shelter. It gets a bit cold at night, but if you huddle together, you might survive. I did. I walked out of the pavilion. I heard Catherine screaming my name, but the sound was muffled by the thick glass. I signaled Mike at the gate. Escort them out, I said. And Mike? Yes. Ms. Waverly? Check the car for leaks before you let them drive off. I don't want oil stains on my driveway. I walked back up the path toward the party. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the garden. I could hear the music playing, a jazz quartet. I took a deep breath of the fresh, expensive air. My heart was beating calmly. My hands were steady. I had just faced the monsters under my bed, and I realized they weren't monsters at all. They were just small, sad people who had made a terrible mistake. They had bet against Aurora Waverly, and the house always wins. The silence in the glass pavilion was absolute, broken only by the hum of the climate control system and the ragged breathing of two people who had just seen their entire worldview shatter into 1,000 irreparable shards. Jonathan and Catherine Waverly were not just shocked. They were experiencing a cognitive collapse. To them, the universe had a hierarchy. They were at the top, and people like the daughter they had discarded were at the bottom. To see the universe inverted, to see the discarded refuse sitting on a throne of gold, was more than their status-obsessed minds could process. I stood by the door, my hand on the cool metal handle, watching the gears grind in my father's head. He looked from the deed on the tablet to my face, then back to the tablet. He was trying to find the loophole. He was trying to find the trick. In his world, success was something you inherited or stole, not something you built from the ashes of a teenage girl's life. "You are lying," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. It was a reflex, a dying gasp of his ego. "You cannot be the CEO. Pendham Tech is Arthur Pendham's company. He was a titan. He was a recluse. He hated everyone. He hated everyone." I corrected him, turning back to face them fully. Except me. I took a step back into the room. I wasn't done. I realized I wanted them to know the specific, delicious irony of my victory. I wanted them to know exactly whose legacy they were begging for. "Do you remember Arthur Pendham, father?" I asked, my voice smooth and dangerous. Jonathan blinked, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Of course I remember him. I tried to get his firm as a client for 10 years. I sent him a bottle of 25-year-old scotch every Christmas. He never responded. He was an arrogant prick. He wasn't arrogant," I said. "He just had a very low tolerance for mediocrity. He used to use your scotch to clean his paintbrushes." Jonathan's face flushed, but I pressed on. "You see, when you threw me out, I didn't just find a job. I found a teacher. Arthur Pendham found me scrubbing his floors with a baby strapped to my chest. He didn't see a stain on society, like you did. He saw a mirror. He saw someone who understood that the world is a code to be cracked." I walked over to the glass wall, looking out at the estate that stretched as far as the eye could see. "He didn't just make me his CEO, Jonathan. He made me his family." I turned back to them, delivering the words that I knew would haunt them until their final breath. When Arthur died, he didn't leave his fortune to charity. He didn't leave it to the government. He left a very specific will. It stated that the entire Pendham empire, every server, every patent, every cent of his $4 billion would go to his legally adopted daughter and sole heir. I tapped my chest. "Me, I am the sole heir. The girl you said was dead to you is the only living beneficiary of the man you spent a decade trying to impress. You wanted to be in his inner circle? Well, congratulations. You are finally in a room with the Pendham legacy. You are looking at it." The impact of the words hit them like a physical wave. Catherine let out a small, strangled sob. Jonathan's mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock. The realization was sinking in. They hadn't just thrown away a daughter. They had thrown away a winning lottery ticket worth billions. They had disowned the goose that laid the golden eggs before she had even laid the first one. Then, something truly grotesque happened. I watched as the shock on Jonathan's face morphed into something else. It was a calculation, a shift in strategy. The arrogance returned, but it was twisted now, desperate and cloying. He straightened his tie. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. He forced a smile that looked like a rictus of pain. "Well," he said, his voice taking on a sickeningly jovial tone. Well. Aurora, this changes things." He took a step toward me, holding his hands out in a placating gesture. "Don't you see?" he asked, his eyes wide and frantic. "It worked." I stared at him. "What worked?" "The plan," he exclaimed, looking at Catherine as if urging her to play along. "My plan. The night I kicked you out. Do you really think I wanted to do that? Do you think it was easy for a father to send his 15-year-old daughter into a blizzard?" He was improvising now, rewriting history with a speed that was almost impressive if it wasn't so morally repugnant. "I knew you were soft, Aurora." He lied, his voice trembling with feigned emotion. "I knew that the Waverly life made you weak. I saw the potential in you, the genius. But it was buried under luxury. I had to be the villain. I had to break you so you could rebuild yourself. I pushed you out of the nest so you would be forced to fly. And look at you now." He gestured around the room. "Claiming credit for my empire. I made you," he declared. "If I hadn't been tough on you, you would still be a spoiled brat living in my guest room. I sacrificed my relationship with you to give you this future. I did it for you. Sweetheart, it was a test, a crucible. And you passed." He looked at me with expectant eyes. waiting for me to fall to my knees and thank him for the trauma, waiting for me to validate his abuse as a strategic parenting decision. Catherine caught on quickly. She scrambled up from her chair, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Yes, exactly, she chimed in, her voice shrill. Oh, Aurora, it broke our hearts to do it. I cried for weeks. But your father said, Catherine, she needs to find her own way. We were so proud of you, watching from afar, waiting for you to come back to us. She began digging frantically in her battered handbag, and we never stopped loving you. She insisted, never. Look, I kept this. I kept this with me every single day. She pulled out a photograph. It was old, creased, and stained with something brown. I recognized it instantly. It was a picture of me and Bradley, taken by a street photographer during the brief, delusional period when we were happy. But that wasn't what she was pointing at. She was pointing at the baby bump visible under my sweater in the photo. I knew about the baby, she whispered, trying to sound conspiratorial. I knew I had a grandchild. Is she here? Is my granddaughter here? She looked toward the door, her eyes hungry. I want to see her. I want to tell her that her Nana is here. We can be a family again. Aurora, you, me, your father. And what is her name? Stella, I said, my voice ice cold. Her name is Stella. Stella, Catherine cried out, clapping her hands together. A beautiful name, a Waverly name. Oh, bring her to me. Let me hold her. We can put all this behind us. We can move into the guest wing. I can help you raise her. A girl needs a grandmother's touch. The level of delusion was suffocating. They actually believed that they could talk their way out of 17 years of abandonment with a 5-minute speech about tough love. They thought that because they were desperate. I would be stupid. They thought the biological tie was a leash they could yank whenever they needed a bailout. I was about to eviscerate them. I was about to list every single night I spent shivering in a shelter, every meal I skipped, every tear I shed while they sat in their mansion drinking wine. I was about to tell them that tough love does not involve throwing an empty suitcase at a child. But I was interrupted. The door to the pavilion, which Marcus had left slightly ajar, pushed open. A small figure stepped in. It was Stella. She was wearing her birthday dress, a custom-made creation of blue silk that matched her eyes. She had a tiara made of fresh flowers in her red hair. She looked like a princess, but she had the sharp, observant gaze of a hawk, a gaze she had inherited from me and refined under Arthur's tutelage. She stopped in the doorway, holding a half-eaten macaron. "Mommy?" she asked. The room froze. Jonathan and Catherine turned to look at her like vampires seeing a fresh vein. This was their ticket. This was their leverage. "Oh," Catherine gasped, lurching forward. "There she is. There is my beautiful granddaughter." She rushed toward Stella, arms outstretched, her face twisted into a grotesque mask of affection. "Stella, darling, I am your Nana. Come give Nana a hug." Stella didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply took a step back, placing herself out of Catherine's reach. She looked at the woman rushing toward her, a woman with disheveled hair, a stained coat, and the frantic energy of a beggar. Then she looked at Jonathan, who was smiling that oily, terrifying smile. Then she looked at me. Her expression wasn't fear. It was confusion mixed with the innocent, brutal honesty of a child who has never known want, but who knows exactly what dignity looks like. She pointed a finger at my parents. "Mommy?" she asked, her voice clear and ringing in the silence. "Who are these beggars?" The word hung in the air. Beggars. It wasn't an insult. To Stella, it was a taxonomy. She saw two people who were dirty, desperate, and asking for things. In her 10-year-old logic, that fit the definition. Catherine stopped dead in her tracks. Her arms dropped to her sides. The smile slid off her face like wet clay. Jonathan looked as if he had been slapped. The word cut deeper than any legal judgment. A child, his own flesh and blood, looked at him and didn't see a judge. Didn't see a patriarch. Didn't see a grandfather. She saw a bum. "Beggars?" Jonathan whispered. his voice trembling with indignation. "We are not our grandparents." Stella wrinkled her nose. She looked at their shoes. She looked at the oil stain on Jonathan's trousers. "They look like the people we give soup to at the shelter on Thanksgiving," Stella said to me. Ignoring him completely, "Why are they in the waiting room? Are we giving them money?" It was the ultimate unintentional cruelty. Stella placed them exactly where they belonged. Objects of charity, not peers of respect. Catherine looked at me, her eyes pleading. "Aurora, tell her who we are. Tell her we are family." I looked at my daughter. She was waiting for an answer. She trusted me to define her world. I could tell her the truth of biology. I could explain the complex, twisted family tree. I could force her to hug these strangers. But I remembered the suitcase. I remembered the snow. I remembered the "not our daughter" declaration. I walked over to Stella and placed a protective hand on her shoulder. I felt the warmth of her solid, real presence against the cold ghost of my past. "No, Stella," I said softly, looking directly into my mother's weeping eyes. "We are not giving them money." "Then who are they?" Stella asked again. I took a deep breath. I looked at Jonathan, stripping him of the last shred of his dignity. "They are just people we used to know," I said, my voice steady and final. "But they chose to leave us a long time ago. They are strangers, Stella. And strangers do not belong in our home." Jonathan made a noise in the back of his throat, a sound of pure impotence. Catherine collapsed back onto the plastic chair, burying her face in her hands. The verdict had been delivered, not by a judge in a courtroom, but by a 10-year-old girl in a flower tiara. They were not villains worthy of fear. They were not parents worthy of love. They were just beggars at the gate. And the gate was closing. "Come on, baby," I said to Stella. Turning my back on them, "The cake is ready." But Stella hesitated, looking back at the weeping woman. "Why is she crying?" "Because she lost something very valuable," I said, guiding Stella out of the glass box, "and she knows she can never, ever get it back." We walked out into the sunshine, leaving the sole air of nothingness behind in the glass cage of their own making. You cannot teach an old dog new tricks, but you can certainly watch him try to bite the hand that refuses to feed him. I had assumed that the humiliation at the gate, witnessed by my daughter and enforced by my security team, would be enough to send Jonathan and Catherine Waverly scurrying back into the shadows. I thought shame would be a sufficient deterrent. I was wrong. I had underestimated the potent combination of desperation and narcissism. When a man like Jonathan Waverly loses his power, he does not reflect on his failures. He looks for someone to blame, and then he looks for a way to monetize that blame. 3 days after the incident at my estate, the process server arrived at Pendham Tech. He was a sweaty man in a cheap suit who looked terrified to be standing in the marble lobby of a $4 billion company. He handed the papers to the receptionist, who handled them with tweezers before passing them to my legal team. It was a lawsuit, but it was not a standard defamation suit or a claim on the estate. Jonathan was too clever for that. He knew he had no grounds to contest Arthur's will. Instead, he had dug deep into the archaic statutes of state law and found a dusty, rarely enforced provision known as filial responsibility. The lawsuit claimed that Jonathan and Catherine were destitute and unable to pay for their basic living expenses or medical care. It argued that I, their biological daughter and a person of significant means, had a statutory obligation to provide them with monthly support. He was demanding $50,000 a month in alimony. Essentially, it was grotesque. It was a legal shakedown. But the lawsuit was just the opening salvo. The real weapon was the media. Jonathan called a press conference outside the crumbling courthouse. He didn't have his expensive suit anymore, but he still had his performance skills. He stood before a gaggle of hungry reporters and cameras, his arm around a weeping Catherine, and told a story that was a masterpiece of fiction. My daughter, Aurora. He told the microphones, his voice breaking with practiced emotion. She has lost her way. We tried to help her. We tried to guide her. But when she found success, when she found this enormous wealth, she cut us off. She left her sick, elderly mother to starve. We are not asking for luxury. We are just asking for mercy. We are asking why a woman worth billions would let the people who gave her life live in squalor. It was the perfect tabloid narrative. The cold ice queen versus the sad elderly parents. It played into every stereotype about the heartless rich. The fallout was immediate. My phone began to ring off the hook. Paparazzi camped outside the gates of my estate, their long lenses pointed at Stella's bedroom window. On social media, the hashtag boycott Pendom began to trend. People who knew nothing about my life, people who had never missed a meal in their lives, were calling me a monster. The stock price of Pendom Tech dipped by 3% in pre-market trading. It was not a crash, but it was a wobble. The board of directors, the same men I had cowed into submission, began to call me Aurora. The chairman said, his voice tight, "This is bad optics. Just pay them. Give them a settlement. Make it go away. It is pocket change to you." I sat in my office, watching the news footage of my father wiping a fake tear from his cheek. No. I said to the chairman, "But the stock." He argued, "The stock will recover." I said, "If I pay them $1, I validate their lie. If I settle, I admit that I owe them something. I owe them nothing but the silence they gave me for 17 years. I hung up. I turned to my computer. I did not call a PR firm. I did not draft a statement denying the allegations. Denials look weak. Denials look like you are hiding something. I opened a secure folder on my private server. It was a folder I had named Pandora. Inside, there were 2 files. The first file was a video. I had retrieved it years ago. Shortly after I started at Pendom Tech, I had hacked into the cloud server of the security company that managed the Waverly estate. They kept archives going back decades on cold storage drives. It had taken me 3 weeks to find the specific date, but I had found it. January 17th, 2009. The timestamp was in the corner. The video was grainy, black and white, and silent, but the image was crystal clear. It showed the foyer of the Waverly mansion. It showed a 15-year-old girl, thin and terrified, clutching a backpack. It showed a man, tall and imposing, screaming. You couldn't hear the words, but you could see the violence in his body language. You could see him point to the door. You could see him pick up a suitcase and hurl it. The suitcase hit the girl. She stumbled back. Then, the most damning part, the man stepped forward and shoved the girl, hard. She fell onto the marble floor. He didn't offer a hand to help her up. He opened the front door, letting the snow swirl in, and gestured into the night. The girl stood up, shaking, and walked out into the blizzard. The man slammed the door and locked it. I watched the video. It still made my stomach turn. But now, it wasn't a memory of trauma. It was a weapon of mass destruction. I opened the second file. This was a dossier I had compiled during my time at Aura Security. When I was building my company, I practiced my data mining skills on targets I knew. My father was my primary test subject. I had dug into his judicial records, his bank accounts, and his emails. I had found the smoking gun 5 years ago. It was a wire transfer of $200,000 from a shell company linked to the Falcone crime family. The transfer date coincided exactly with the dismissal of a vehicular manslaughter charge against the son of a known mob associate. Jonathan had presided over that case. He had suppressed evidence. He had let a killer walk free. And he had bought a summer home with the blood money. I had never used it. I had held it in reserve, waiting for the moment when he would try to destroy me. That moment was now. I picked up my phone and called the head of my media relations team. "Do not issue a statement," I ordered. "Just upload the files I'm sending you to our official press page. Caption the video. The truth about the Waverly eviction. Caption the documents. The reason Judge Waverly lost his license." "Are you sure?" the press officer asked. "This is nuclear." "Aurora, launch it." I said. I sat back and watched the world burn. The reaction was not a ripple. It was a tidal wave. Within an hour of the upload, The video had 5 million views. The internet detectives, the same ones who had been vilifying me an hour ago, dissected the footage. They saw the violence. They saw the cruelty. They saw a child being thrown into a death trap. The narrative flipped so fast it gave the media whiplash. Suddenly, I wasn't the heartless billionaire. I was the survivor. I was the girl who beat the odds. The hashtag boycott Pendham vanished, replaced by justice for Aurora. Then came the second wave. The documents. The bribery evidence didn't just trend on social media. It landed on the desk of the district attorney. The same legal system that Jonathan had manipulated for years turned its gaze upon him. He wasn't just a bad father anymore. He was a corrupt judge. He was a criminal. By the afternoon, the news helicopters had moved from my estate to the shabby apartment complex where my parents lived. But they weren't filming a tearful plea for help anymore. They were filming the arrival of the Illinois State Police. I watched the live feed on my office monitor. I saw Jonathan being led out in handcuffs. He looked smaller than ever. He wasn't performing for the cameras this time. He was hiding his face. He knew that the game was over. The fraud, the extortion, the bribery. It was all out in the open. The filial responsibility lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice. Before the ink was even dry, no judge in the state would entertain a motion from a man currently being booked for felony corruption. I closed the browser window. I felt a strange sense of hollowness. It wasn't joy. It was just the satisfaction of a ledger finally being balanced. I was preparing to leave the office, to go home to Gabriel and Stella. When my private line rang, it was a number I didn't recognize. "This is Aurora," I said. There was a silence on the other end. Then, a voice I knew better than my own. "Aurora?" It was Catherine. I didn't hang up. I wanted to hear this. I wanted to hear what she could possibly say now that her husband was in a holding cell and her reputation was incinerated. "What do you want?" "Catherine?" I asked. "I am downstairs," she whispered. Her voice was trembling, but it wasn't the fake tremble she had used at the press conference. It was the terrified shake of an animal caught in a trap. "I am in the lobby of your building. Please, security won't let me up." "Why would they?" I asked. "You are the woman who just accused their CEO of elder abuse on national television." "He made me do it," she cried. "It was Jonathan. He wrote the script. He told me what to say. He said it was the only way to get money. You know how he is." "Aurora, you know I couldn't say no to him. I was a victim too." I listened to her rewrite history again. It was fascinating. She was pivoting. She was abandoning the sinking ship that was Jonathan Waverly and trying to swim to the lifeboat that was me. "I am not like him," she pleaded. "I am your mother. I didn't throw the suitcase. I was scared. And now he is going to prison. They are talking about 10 years. Aurora. 10 years. I can't be alone. I have nothing. The landlord is evicting us tomorrow because the police raided the apartment. So what is your plan?" "Catherine?" I asked, my voice devoid of sympathy. "I need to leave," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I found a flight to Arizona. I have a sister there. You remember Aunt Deborah? She said I could stay on her couch. But I have no money for the ticket. I have no money for a taxi." She paused, waiting for me to offer. "Just give me $5,000. Aurora. That is all I ask. Cash. I will disappear. You will never see me again. I will divorce him. I will testify against him if you want. Just get me out of here." I sat in my leather chair, looking out at the city lights. I thought about the woman who had adjusted the flowers while I was being disowned. I thought about the woman who had looked at my daughter and seen a paycheck. She was willing to sell her husband to save herself. She was willing to sell her dignity for a plane ticket. "Stay there," I said. I hung up. I didn't go downstairs. I called Marcus, my head of security. "Marcus, my mother is in the lobby. I know. Ms. Waverly. We are watching her. Do you want us to remove her?" "No." I said, "She wants to go to Arizona. She wants to disappear." I opened my drawer and took out an envelope. I put a single check inside. It wasn't for $5,000. It was for $500. Enough for a bus ticket. Not a plane ticket. and enough for a few meals. Give her this, I said, and tell her that if she ever mentions the name Waverly again, if she ever tries to contact me or my daughter, I will release the rest of the files in the Pandora folder. What is in the rest of the files? Marcus asked, though he knew better than to pry. Her signature, I said, on the fraudulent tax returns Jonathan filed 5 years ago. She isn't innocent, Marcus. She just wasn't the one holding the gun, but she helped load the bullets. Understood, Marcus said. I watched on the security feed as Marcus walked down to the lobby. I saw him hand the envelope to Catherine. She opened it frantically. I saw her face fall when she saw the amount. She argued. She pointed at the ceiling. She cried. Marcus simply crossed his arms and pointed to the door. She looked around. She looked at the opulent lobby she would never belong to. And then she took the money. She stuffed it into her coat pocket and walked out the revolving doors. She didn't look back. She didn't go to see her husband in jail. She didn't try to fight for him. She took the cash and ran. It was the most honest thing she had ever done. I turned off the monitor. The office was quiet. The war was over. Jonathan was in a cage, and Catherine was on a Greyhound bus to oblivion. I picked up my bag. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt clean. The stain that Jonathan had talked about 17 years ago, the stain of poverty, of shame, was gone. But it wasn't because I had money. It was because I had finally scrubbed them out of my life. I took the elevator down to the garage. Gabriel was waiting for me in the car. Stella asleep in the back seat. Is it done? Gabriel asked, as I slid into the passenger seat. It is done, I said. He didn't ask for details. He just took my hand and squeezed it. Let's go home, he said. We drove out of the city, leaving the wreckage of the Waverly family in the rearview mirror, shrinking smaller and smaller until they were nothing but dust. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a storm. It is not the silence of peace, but the silence of absolute devastation, where the air itself feels scrubbed clean by the violence of the wind. The legal and media war against my parents had lasted only 72 hours, but it had felt like a lifetime. In that short span, the facade of the Waverly family had been dismantled, brick by brick, until nothing remained but the ugly structural rot that had been holding it up all along. I had one final piece of business to conclude. Marcus had informed me that despite taking the $500 in the lobby, Catherine had not left the city. Desperation creates a stubborn kind of hope. She was staying in a motel on the outskirts of town, calling my office repeatedly, claiming she had important information she could only deliver in person. It was a bluff. Of course, she had no information. She only had greed and a lingering belief that she could manipulate my emotions one last time. I agreed to meet her, not because I wanted to see her, but because I needed to close the book. I needed to sign the final page so I could put it on the shelf and never take it down again. We met at a small sidewalk cafe in the downtown district, a place where the noise of the traffic provided a veil of privacy. I arrived 5 minutes early. I sat at a metal table, wearing a white trench coat and sunglasses. Watching the pedestrians rush by, they were all going somewhere, living lives that were messy and beautiful and real. I felt a strange sense of detachment, like an astronaut looking back at Earth. Catherine arrived 10 minutes late. It was a power play she had used her whole life, trying to make the other person wait. But today it just looked pathetic. She was wearing a coat that was too thin for the autumn chill, and her hands were shaking as she pulled out the chair opposite me. She looked at me with eyes that were red-rimmed and hungry. She didn't order coffee. She probably couldn't afford it. Aurora, she breathed, leaning across the table. Thank you for coming. I knew you would come. I knew you wouldn't just abandon me. I didn't take off my sunglasses. I didn't smile. You have 5 minutes. Catherine, I said. She flinched, but quickly recovered her composure. She reached out to touch my hand, but I moved it away. I know things are bad, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Jonathan, your father, he is ruined. The lawyers say he is looking at 5 to 10 years in prison. The assets are frozen. I have nothing. Aurora, The government took the accounts. They even took my car. She paused, waiting for sympathy. When none came, she pressed on. I need a fresh start. You understand that, don't you? You of all people understand what it means to start over. I want to go away, just like you said, but I can't do it with $500. I need a cushion. I need to be safe. She looked at the expensive leather bag sitting on the chair next to me. If you could just help me get settled, she said. I was thinking maybe 100,000. It is nothing to you. It is a drop in the ocean, and in exchange, I promise I will never speak to the press again. I will disappear. You will have your life, and I will have well. I will have a chance to survive. I stared at her, even now, at the bitter end. She was transaction-minded. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was negotiating a severance package. I reached into my bag. Catherine's eyes lit up. She sat up straighter, licking her dry lips. She expected a checkbook. She expected a stack of cash. She expected the golden parachute that the wealthy always seem to find. I pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. I slid it across the metal table. Catherine grabbed it. Her hands were trembling with excitement. She tore it open, her fingers fumbling with the seal. Oh, thank you. Aurora, she babbled. Thank you. I knew you were a good girl. I knew you loved your mother. She pulled out the contents. Her smile froze. It wasn't a check. It wasn't cash. It was a single piece of paper printed with a boarding pass and a glossy brochure. She stared at them, confused. What is this? She asked, her voice shrill. It is a ticket, I said calmly. One way. Economy class. Departing O'Hare Airport in 4 hours. Destination: Phoenix, Arizona. She looked at the brochure. It was for a government-funded employment center in downtown Phoenix called Second Chances. It specialized in finding manual labor jobs for seniors and people with no prior work experience. I don't understand, she whispered, looking up at me with horror. Where is the money? There is no money. Catherine, I said. I leaned forward, lowering my sunglasses so she could look into my eyes and see that there was absolutely no mercy left in them. You said you wanted a fresh start. I am giving you one. That ticket gets you to a new state where nobody knows who you are. That center will help you find a job. They are hiring cleaners for the municipal buildings. It pays minimum wage. It is honest work. Cleaners? She choked out. You expect me to be a cleaner? I am Catherine Waverly. You are Catherine Waverly, the wife of a disgraced felon. I corrected her. You have no skills. You have no assets. You have no friends. I stood up, buttoning my coat. You made a choice 17 years ago, I said, my voice ringing with finality. You chose your comfort over my life. You chose to sit on a velvet sofa while your daughter walked into a blizzard. You chose the easy way. Well, the easy way is gone. I pointed at the brochure in her hand. Now, you are going to learn what I learned. You are going to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet. You are going to learn the value of $1 earned with sweat. It is the most valuable lesson I ever received, and now I am gifting it to you. Aurora, please, she begged, grabbing the edge of the table. I can't do that. I am too old. I will die. I survived, I said, and I was a child. You are a grown woman. Figure it out. I turned and walked away. I heard her sobbing behind me. A raw, ugly sound of a woman realizing that the world does not owe her a living. She had lost the game because she never realized that the rules had changed. She was still playing for status, while I was playing for survival. As I walked down the street, I checked the time. It was 11 o'clock in the morning. Across town, in a squalid apartment complex that smelled of failure, a different scene was playing out. I wasn't there, but I knew exactly what was happening because I had orchestrated the timing perfectly. Jonathan Waverly was sitting on a stained mattress, wearing a t-shirt that had seen better days. The police were pounding on the door. He knew they were coming. The warrant had been issued an hour ago. He wasn't running. He had nowhere to run. He was watching the small, fuzzy television set perched on a stack of milk crates. On the screen was the live feed from the New York Stock Exchange. The banner at the bottom of the screen read, Pendum Tech lists subsidiary Aura Security in historic public offering. The camera panned to the balcony overlooking the trading floor. The crowd was cheering. Confetti was falling. And there, standing in the center, was me. It was a pre-recorded broadcast from earlier that morning. But Jonathan didn't know that. He watched as the aurora on the screen, radiant in a white suit, reached out and rang the opening bell. The sound was clear and triumphant, a chime that signaled the creation of billions of dollars of new wealth. The aurora on the screen smiled, a smile of pure, unadulterated victory. At that exact moment, the door to Jonathan's apartment burst open. Police! Show us your hands! Jonathan didn't look at the officers. He couldn't take his eyes off the screen. He watched his daughter, the girl he had thrown away like garbage, conquer the world. He saw the adoration in the eyes of the traders. He saw the power radiating from her. And in that moment, as the officer grabbed his wrist and slapped the cold metal of the handcuffs onto his skin, Jonathan Waverly finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. He hadn't just lost a daughter, he had lost his immortality. He was going to prison as a nobody, while the name he had tried to protect was being elevated to the stars by the very person he had disowned. He began to weep, not for me, but for himself. And that was the only eulogy his old life deserved. I returned home just as the sun was beginning to set. The drive back to the estate was peaceful. The tension that had lived in my shoulders for 17 years, the constant, low-level hum of what if, was gone. I walked through the front door. The house was warm. It smelled of garlic and roasting tomatoes. I walked into the kitchen. Gabriel was at the stove, stirring a pot of pasta sauce. He was wearing an apron over his work clothes, and he was singing along to a jazz record playing in the background. Stella was sitting at the kitchen island, doing her homework. She looked up when I entered. "Mommy!" she yelled, jumping off the stool. She ran to me and wrapped her arms around my waist. I buried my face in her hair, smelling the strawberry shampoo and the innocence of a childhood that was safe, secure, and loved. "Did you finish your work?" she asked, looking up at me with those bright, intelligent eyes. "Yes, baby," I said, kissing her forehead. "I finished it, all of it." Gabriel turned around. He looked at my face. He knew. He saw the peace in my eyes. He didn't say a word. He just smiled, walked over, and kissed me gently on the lips. "Hungry?" he asked. "Starving," I said. We sat down to dinner. It wasn't a banquet. It wasn't a gala. It was just spaghetti and meatballs, served on the kitchen table. We talked about Stella's science project. We talked about the new cherry trees Gabriel wanted to plant. We laughed. There were no secrets here. There was no fear that a mistake would lead to exile. There was only the solid, unshakable foundation of a family built on choice, not obligation. Later that night, after tucking Stella into bed and reading her a chapter of a book about galaxies far away, I went to my dressing room. I stood in front of the full-length mirror. I looked at the woman reflected there. I saw the fine lines starting to appear around the eyes, lines from smiling, not frowning. I saw the strength in the jawline. I saw the scar on my hand from a burn I got working at the diner all those years ago. I touched the mirror. For the longest time, I had defined myself by what I had lost. I was the girl who lost her parents. I was the girl who lost her home. I was the girl who lost her first love. But looking at myself now, I realized that I hadn't lost anything. I had shed them, like a snake shedding a skin that was too small, too constricting, too dry. My parents had tried to bury me. They thought I was a seed that would rot in the frozen ground. They didn't know that I was a seed that needed the cold to break open. They didn't know that the pressure of the earth was the only thing that could make me grow roots strong enough to hold up the sky. I walked out onto the balcony of my bedroom. The air was crisp, reminding me of that night in Chicago, but the cold didn't bite anymore. It felt refreshing. I looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, Arthur Pendham was probably laughing at the efficiency of my revenge. Somewhere in a cell, Jonathan was staring at a concrete wall. Somewhere on a bus, Catherine was clutching a brochure and realizing that life is hard. But here, in this fortress of love and success, I was free. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the night air. They threw me into the abyss to die. I whispered to the darkness. They wanted to erase me. They didn't know that I wasn't born to climb out of the hole they dug. I was born to fly over it. I am Aurora. The dawn has broken, and the night is finally over. Thank you so much for listening to my story on Sweet Rose Drama. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment down below sharing your location and your thoughts on how I handled my parents. Did they get what they deserved? If you enjoyed this story of justice and resilience, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people. Your support means the world to us. Until next time.